When the train caught fire, Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock fought back together. The train was never supposed to be memorable. It was meant to be one of those quiet, in-between journeys that slipped unnoticed between louder moments of life. A practical decision, a shared route, a moving corridor of steel carrying people towards separate destinations. Yet sometimes, the most ordinary choices become the doorway to extraordinary tests of character. Keanu Reeves sat by the window, his reflection faintly layered over the passing countryside. He wasn't watching the scenery as much as he was letting it move through him, the way motion sometimes helps thoughts settle. He had chosen the train deliberately, not for comfort or speed, but for the strange calm it gave him. Planes ended things too quickly. Cars demanded attention. Trains allowed silence. They allowed thought. Across the aisle, Sandra Bullock adjusted the strap of her bag and exhaled quietly, unaware that her presence had already altered the emotional temperature of the carriage. She hadn't planned on seeing him. In fact, she had chosen this route for the same reason he had: distance from noise, from expectation, from the constant pressure to perform. She wanted anonymity, even if only for a few hours. When their eyes met, it was not dramatic. There was no sudden music cue, no sharp intake of breath. It was softer than that. A pause, a recognition, a mutual understanding that life, once again, had placed them side by side without explanation. They exchanged a small smile, the kind that didn't ask questions, the kind that said, "We are both here, and that is enough for now." The train hummed forward, steel wheels singing against the rails. Conversations rose and fell around them, business travelers discussing deadlines, a couple whispering over coffee, a child asking endless questions. It was a moving portrait of ordinary human life, layered and imperfect. Keanu broke the silence first, his voice calm and unassuming. "Didn't expect to see you here." Sandra smiled, her tone light but sincere. "Same, I guess the universe likes surprises." They didn't speak much after that. They didn't need to. Their shared history allowed for comfortable quiet, the kind built not on obligation but on mutual respect. They both understood that some connections didn't need constant maintenance to remain strong. They simply were. Minutes passed, then an hour. The train continued its steady rhythm, slicing through stretches of land that seemed endless and untroubled. No one sensed what was coming. No one ever does. It started subtly, the way danger often does, not with chaos but with discomfort. A faint smell drifted through the carriage. At first it was easy to dismiss. Hot metal, perhaps, overworked brakes, someone's coffee scorched on a heating plate. People shifted in their seats, glanced around, then returned to their distractions. Sandra noticed it again, sharper this time. She frowned slightly and looked toward the far end of the car. "Do you smell that?" Keanu nodded, his expression tightening just enough to signal concern. "Yeah, that's not normal." The hum of the train changed. It wasn't loud, but it was different, a strained vibration like something working harder than it should. A few passengers stood, peering down the aisle. Someone laughed nervously, trying to keep things light. Then the lights flickered. Once, twice. The carriage fell quiet in that instant, as if everyone's instincts had aligned. Fear doesn't always arrive screaming. Sometimes it steps in softly and waits for recognition. A sudden jolt rippled through the train, sharp enough to send a ripple of gasps through the passengers. Luggage shifted. A child began to cry. The smell intensified, no longer ignorable, thick and biting. Smoke, not billowing yet but present enough to change the air, to make breathing feel heavier, more deliberate. A voice crackled over the intercom, strained and uneven. "Attention, passengers, please remain calm. We are experiencing a technical issue. Assistance is being arranged." Remain calm. The phrase was familiar, but it rarely carried the comfort it promised. Sandra stood instinctively, scanning the car. Panic had not fully taken hold yet, but uncertainty was spreading fast. People looked to one another, searching for cues on how to react. Keanu rose beside her, his movements controlled, grounded. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He was simply responding the way he always had, by paying attention. At the far end of the carriage, thin wisps of smoke began to curl along the ceiling. A woman covered her mouth. A man swore under his breath. Someone shouted a question no one could answer. Sandra felt her pulse quicken, but her mind remained clear. Fear was present, yes, but it wasn't in control. She glanced at Keanu, and in that look passed an unspoken agreement: we don't wait. They moved forward together, not pushing, not rushing, but with purpose. Keanu spoke first, his voice steady and loud enough to cut through the rising noise. "Everyone, take a breath. There's no need to panic. Let's figure out what's happening." Authority doesn't always come from volume or command. Sometimes it comes from calm certainty, and people responded to it instinctively. Sandra added, her tone reassuring. "Please stay low if the smoke gets thicker. Help each other. We'll get through this." The smoke grew darker, spreading faster now, driven by the train's motion. Heat followed, subtle but undeniable, radiating from somewhere beyond the sealed door between carriages. A crew member appeared, his face pale, his uniform smeared with soot. "There's a fire in one of the rear cars," he said quickly. "We're trying to isolate it, but—" A sudden shudder interrupted him, and the lights went out completely. Darkness swallowed the carriage, followed by the collective intake of breath from dozens of strangers now bound by fear and uncertainty. Emergency lights flickered on moments later, dim and red, casting long shadows across anxious faces. The air felt heavier, the smoke thicker. Sandra felt someone grab her arm, an elderly man trembling. "What do we do?" She squeezed his hand gently, grounding him. "We stay together, we listen, we move when we're told. You're not alone." Keanu was already coordinating with the crew member, asking clear, practical questions. "How many exits are functional? Is there an emergency stop protocol?" The crew member swallowed hard. "We can stop the train, but evacuation will take time. The fire suppression system is struggling." Time, it was always time that made the difference between fear and disaster. The train began to slow, metal screaming faintly as brakes engaged. The motion threw some passengers off balance, but Keanu and Sandra moved instinctively, helping steady those around them. A mother clutched her child. A man struggled with a suitcase he should have abandoned long ago. "Leave it," Sandra urged gently. "Your safety comes first." The smoke was thicker now, stinging eyes, scratching throats. Panic finally began to rise, voices overlapping, fear spilling out in sharp bursts. This was the moment when chaos could take over, when people stopped thinking and started running. Keanu stepped onto a seat, giving himself visibility without dominating the space. His voice cut through the noise, calm but firm. "Listen to me. Panic will only make this worse. We're stopping. Help each other. Stay low. Follow the crew." Something in his tone anchored people. They listened because they wanted to believe him. They listened because fear needs leadership as much as hope does. Sandra moved through the aisle, checking on people, meeting eyes, offering reassurance in small, human ways. A nod, a touch on the shoulder, a quiet word. These gestures didn't erase fear, but they transformed it into something manageable. The train shuddered to a halt. Silence followed, broken only by the distant crackle of flames and the hiss of strained machinery. The doors did not open immediately. Smoke continued to seep in, curling around ankles, rising slowly like an inevitable tide. "We need to be ready," Sandra said quietly to Keanu. "If the doors jam." He nodded. "We adapt." That was the thing about resilience. It wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It showed up in moments exactly like this, when plans failed and certainty vanished. The intercom crackled again, the voice weaker now. "We are preparing for evacuation. Please remain." A sharp sound interrupted the message, followed by a burst of sparks near the door connecting to the next carriage. The fire was closer than anyone wanted to admit. The crew member swore softly. "We can't wait much longer." Keanu looked at Sandra, his expression serious but composed. "Then we don't." Together, they helped organize the nearest passengers, prioritizing children, the elderly, anyone struggling to breathe. It wasn't about heroics. It was about responsibility. As the emergency doors finally began to open with a grinding protest of metal, cool air rushed in, a sharp contrast to the heat and smoke inside. Relief surged through the carriage, but Keanu raised his hand. "Slowly," he said, "one at a time, we'll all get out." Sandra stood near the exit, guiding people down, making sure no one was left behind. She caught sight of fear in every face, but also something else: trust. Strangers trusting strangers, simply because there was no other choice. When the last passenger stepped onto the gravel beside the tracks, the fire behind them flared brighter, casting an orange glow through the open door. The danger was real now, undeniable. Keanu and Sandra were the last to exit. As they stepped away from the train, the weight of what had happened finally settled in. Sirens echoed in the distance. Emergency crews were on their way. The immediate danger had passed, but the emotional aftershocks were just beginning. Sandra took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly now that the adrenaline was fading. That could have been so much worse. Keanu nodded, his gaze fixed on the smoking train. But it was because people helped each other. Around them, passengers huddled together, strangers offering water, comfort, quiet words. In the aftermath of fear, something unexpected had emerged, not panic, not blame, but connection. Sandra looked at Keanu, a soft, knowing smile breaking through the exhaustion. "You always stay calm." He shrugged gently. "So do you, that's how people make it through." The fire crackled behind them, but it no longer felt like the center of the story. The real story was standing right there on the gravel, people who had chosen kindness over fear, cooperation over chaos, resilience over surrender. And this was only the beginning. After the flames, when fear tested the strength of the human spirit, the cold air outside the train hit harder than anyone expected. It wasn't just the temperature. It was the sudden contrast between danger and survival, between the suffocating smoke they had escaped and the open night that now surrounded them. The tracks stretched endlessly in both directions, silent witnesses to what had just happened. The burning train behind them crackled and hissed, its metal shell glowing faintly as emergency responders rushed closer with flashing lights cutting through the darkness. For many of the passengers, the moment they stepped off the train meant collapse. Some sat on the gravel, others leaned against one another, their legs weak from adrenaline and fear. A few cried openly, not from injury, but from the sheer release of tension they had been holding inside. Survival has a way of undoing people, stripping them down to raw emotion once the danger passes. Sandra Bullock stood slightly apart, her arms wrapped around herself as if grounding her body in the present. Her breathing was steady, but her thoughts were not. Images replayed in her mind. The thickening smoke, the frightened faces, the moment the fire surged closer than expected. She had stayed strong for everyone else, but now the weight of responsibility pressed against her chest. Keanu Reeves noticed before she said a word. He always did. He stepped closer, his presence quiet but reassuring, like an anchor dropped into uncertain waters. "You okay?" he asked softly, knowing that the question wasn't simple. She nodded slowly, then shook her head just as slowly, a small, honest contradiction. "I will be. I keep thinking about how fast things could have gone wrong." Keanu followed her gaze toward the train, now partially surrounded by firefighters. "That's the part people don't talk about," he said. "How close chaos always is, and how much it matters what we do when it shows up." Around them, emergency personnel began organizing the passengers, handing out blankets and water, checking for injuries. Names were called, headcounts taken, reassurance repeated again and again. The structure helped, but fear lingered in the air like a ghost that hadn't yet realized it no longer belonged. An elderly woman sat alone on a nearby embankment, staring at the ground, her hands shaking despite the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Sandra noticed her immediately. Without hesitation, she walked over and knelt beside her, lowering herself to eye level. She spoke gently, not with rehearsed comfort, but with genuine care. The woman's eyes slowly lifted, meeting Sandra's, and in that moment something shifted. Fear softened, breathing steadied, connection did what authority could not. Keanu watched from a short distance away, then turned his attention to a young father struggling to calm his son. The boy clung tightly to his jacket, eyes wide, body rigid with shock. Keanu crouched down, keeping his voice low and calm. He didn't tell the child everything would be fine. He told him the truth in the kindest way possible, that the danger was over, that people were helping, that he was safe right now. Sometimes honesty, delivered gently, is the strongest form of reassurance. As minutes turned into longer stretches of time, the immediate chaos settled into a quieter kind of uncertainty. Where would they go next? How long would they be stranded? Would transportation arrive soon? These practical questions replaced panic, but they still weighed heavily on everyone present. Sandra and Keanu found themselves naturally moving between groups, offering help without drawing attention. They carried water bottles, shared blankets, listened to stories that needed to be told immediately before fear could harden into something permanent. No cameras were present. No audience watched. This wasn't performance, it was instinct. At one point, a train official approached them, recognition flickering briefly across his exhausted face. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said sincerely. "You helped keep things from getting out of control." Keanu shook his head lightly. People did that themselves, we just reminded them they could. Sandra added quietly, everyone showed up for each other, that's what mattered. The official nodded, visibly moved, then returned to his duties. Praise had never been the point, survival had been. As the night deepened, the full emotional toll of the experience began to surface. Some passengers grew quiet, withdrawn into their thoughts. Others talked nonstop, replaying events, searching for meaning or reassurance in repetition. Trauma doesn't follow one path, it spreads differently through every person it touches. Sandra sat on a piece of luggage near the tracks, her posture composed but tired. Keanu joined her, leaving enough space to respect silence while still offering presence. The glow of emergency lights reflected faintly in his eyes. "You know," she said after a long pause, "when things started going wrong, I kept thinking about how easy it would have been to freeze, to just wait for someone else to take control." Keanu nodded slowly. Most people feel that, the moment when fear asks you whether you'll step forward or disappear. "And you stepped forward," she continued, "without hesitation." He considered her words carefully before responding. "So did you just didn't announce it." They shared a quiet smile, one built on understanding rather than ego. They both knew that courage didn't always look dramatic. Often it looked like staying calm when everything inside wanted to panic, like choosing empathy when fear demanded self-preservation. Nearby, a group of passengers began helping one another organize belongings salvaged from the train. Someone passed around snacks. Another offered a phone charger. Small acts of kindness multiplied, creating a fragile but real sense of community among strangers who might never meet again after this night. Sandra watched them, emotion tightening her throat. "It's strange," she said softly, "how something so terrifying can also remind you of the best parts of people." Keanu followed her gaze. "Adversity doesn't create character," he said, "it reveals it." The sound of approaching buses finally broke through the night, a wave of relief rippling through the stranded crowd. Transportation had arrived to take them to safety, to warmth, to rest. The chapter of danger was closing, but the impact of it would linger far longer. As passengers lined up to board, many paused to thank one another, to exchange names, to share brief hugs that said more than words could. These connections were temporary, but the memory of them would endure. Sandra and Keanu stood near the back of the line, watching as the last few passengers boarded. The fire behind them had been contained now, reduced to smoldering remains under the careful watch of firefighters. The threat was over, but the lesson remained vivid. When they finally boarded the bus themselves, exhaustion settled in fully, the kind that comes not from physical exertion alone, but from emotional vigilance. Sandra leaned back against the seat, closing her eyes for a moment. Keanu sat beside her, his posture relaxed but attentive. "You handled that incredibly well," he said quietly, not as praise, but as acknowledgement. She opened her eyes and smiled faintly. "We handled it together." The bus began to move, carrying them away from the tracks, away from the smoke, away from the night that had tested everyone present. Outside the window, darkness stretched endlessly, but inside the bus there was warmth, light, and the quiet hum of shared survival. No one spoke much now. Words had been used up. What remained was reflection. Sandra thought about how easily this night could have ended differently, how fragile safety truly was. Keanu thought about how resilience didn't belong to heroes or headlines, but to ordinary people who chose compassion under pressure. They didn't know how this experience would shape them in the days to come, but they knew one thing with certainty. When fear arrived, they had not turned away. They had stood in it together and chosen something better. And as the bus disappeared into the distance, carrying survivors toward the next chapter of their lives, the story of the burning train transformed into something more than an emergency. It became a reminder that even in moments of fire and fear, the human spirit has the power to rise, to connect, and to endure. The quiet aftermath, how strength is forged when no one is watching. Morning arrived gently, almost apologetically, as if the world itself understood what the night had taken from those who lived through it. Pale sunlight filtered through the windows of the temporary shelter where the passengers had been brought, illuminating tired faces and bodies finally allowed to rest. The chaos of the fire felt distant now, yet its imprint lingered in every slow movement, every thoughtful silence, every breath taken with deliberate awareness. Sandra Bullock woke before most of the others, her body stiff, her mind already active. Sleep had come in fragments, interrupted by half-formed dreams of smoke and flickering lights. She sat up slowly, grounding herself in the present, reminding herself that the danger was over. Still, the memory of fear carried weight. Survival doesn't disappear with daylight. It settles into the muscles, the mind, the heart. Keanu Reeves was already awake, seated near a window with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. He wasn't drinking it. He was watching the morning unfold outside, as if observing something fragile that might vanish if acknowledged too directly. When Sandra noticed him, he turned and offered a small, familiar smile, one that carried understanding without needing explanation. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked quietly as she joined him, her voice still rough from smoke and exhaustion. "A little," he replied honestly. "Enough to know I'll remember everything." She nodded, knowing exactly what he meant. Some experiences carve themselves too deeply to be erased by rest. Around them, the shelter slowly came to life. People stirred, conversations resumed in hushed tones, and the logistics of moving forward began to take shape. Officials moved through the room with clipboards and calm voices, arranging transportation, offering information, guiding people back toward normalcy. But normal felt far away. It always does after something breaks your sense of safety. Sandra watched a young woman across the room laugh softly at something her friend said, the sound fragile but real. It struck her how quickly life insists on continuing, even when hearts are still catching up. "It's strange," she murmured, "how people start rebuilding before they realize they're doing it." Keanu followed her gaze. "That's resilience," he said, "not loud, not dramatic, just persistent." As the hours passed, passengers began to depart one by one, each goodbye carrying the weight of a shared ordeal. Some exchanged phone numbers, promising to stay in touch. Others embraced briefly, knowing words would only complicate something that felt complete in its simplicity. Shared survival creates a bond that doesn't need maintenance. It exists whether acknowledged or not. Sandra and Keanu stayed longer than most, helping where they could, listening when someone needed to talk, offering presence instead of solutions. It wasn't obligation that kept them there. It was understanding. They knew that sometimes the most important moments happen after the crisis, when adrenaline fades and emotions finally surface. An older man approached them hesitantly, his posture cautious, his voice unsteady but sincere. "I just wanted to thank you both," he said. "Last night when everything went dark, I really thought that was it. Seeing you stay calm, it gave me something to hold on to." Sandra felt her throat tighten. She reached out and touched his arm gently. "You held on to yourself," she said. "We just helped remind you." He smiled, eyes shining, and walked away lighter than before. Moments like that stayed with her, embedding themselves quietly into her understanding of what it truly meant to help someone. Later that afternoon, once the shelter had mostly emptied and arrangements were finalized, Sandra and Keanu finally stepped outside together. The air felt different now, clearer, as if even the environment had exhaled after holding its breath. Cars passed in the distance, ordinary and unremarkable, a reminder that life had not stopped for the world beyond the tracks. They walked slowly, not in any particular direction, letting conversation unfold naturally. There was no rush to return to schedules or obligations. The experience had created a pause, and both of them felt the importance of honoring it. "You know," Sandra said thoughtfully, "there's this expectation that after something like that, you're supposed to feel grateful, like fear automatically turns into appreciation." Keanu listened carefully, nodding, "But it's not that simple." "No," she agreed. "Sometimes it turns into questions about what matters, about what you ignore when things are comfortable." He considered her words. Fear strips away distractions. It doesn't give answers, but it shows you which questions are worth asking. They stopped near a quiet overlook where the tracks curved away into the distance. The burned train had been removed by now, leaving only scorched ground as evidence of what had happened. The absence felt heavy, like a scar where something violent had been. Sandra folded her arms, absorbing the sight. "I keep thinking about the people who froze, the ones who couldn't move, couldn't speak." Keanu replied gently, "Freezing is human. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's what you do when fear is present." She looked at him then, truly looked at him, and saw the truth in his words reflected in his calm expression. "You don't talk about these things like someone who's rehearsed them." He smiled faintly, "Because they're not ideas, they're experiences." The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the ground. Time moved forward whether they were ready or not. Eventually, they would return to their separate paths, to lives filled with noise, expectations, and responsibilities. But something had shifted, something subtle yet permanent. As they headed back toward the waiting transportation that would carry them onward, Sandra felt a quiet clarity settle within her. The fire had taken something, comfort, illusion, ease, but it had also revealed something invaluable. The reminder that in moments of crisis, humanity still finds a way to surface, often through the simplest acts of care. Keanu sensed the change in her just as she sensed it in him. Shared experiences don't always need words to be acknowledged. Sometimes they live in silence, shaping decisions yet to be made. When they finally parted ways later that evening, there were no dramatic farewells. Just a quiet understanding, a mutual respect deepened by adversity. They knew they would carry this story with them, not as a tale of danger, but as a lesson in resilience, empathy, and the quiet power of choosing to stand together when it matters most. The fire had tested them, but it had not defined them. Instead, it had revealed the strength that was already there, waiting for the moment it was needed. And that strength, once discovered, never truly fades. The echoes of fire, how one night quietly changed everything. Time moved forward, as it always does, but it did not move evenly. In the days following the train fire, life resumed on the surface, yet underneath, something subtle had shifted. For Sandra Bullock, the ordinary rhythm of her routine felt slightly unfamiliar, as if the world she had returned to was the same in shape but different in texture. Conversations sounded normal, schedules filled up again, responsibilities reclaimed their space, but there was a quiet echo in her thoughts that refused to fade. It wasn't fear, it was awareness. She found herself noticing details she might once have overlooked. The way people avoided eye contact on crowded streets, the tension hiding behind polite smiles, the fragile balance everyone maintained between control and vulnerability. The fire had not followed her home physically, but emotionally it had left a mark, reminding her how thin the line was between stability and chaos, and how quickly that line could disappear without warning. Keanu Reeves experienced something similar, though he processed it differently. Where Sandra reflected outward, he turned inward. He spent long hours walking, letting the city move around him while his thoughts settled into place. He wasn't haunted by the event, but he wasn't untouched either. Moments from the train replayed not as trauma, but as questions. Why had some people panicked while others stepped forward? Why had calm spread as quickly as fear once leadership appeared? And what responsibility did those who could remain calm carry toward those who could? The answers were not immediate, nor were they simple. Keanu understood that resilience wasn't a trait people either had or lacked. It was a muscle, strengthened or weakened by experience, by environment, by whether someone had ever been shown how to stay steady in the face of fear. The train fire had been a brutal lesson, but it had also been a teacher. When Sandra and Keanu spoke again days later, it wasn't planned. It rarely was. A short message turned into a longer conversation, and before either of them fully realized it, they were sitting across from each other in a quiet cafe, the kind where conversations stayed private and time moved more slowly. There was no need to recount the event in detail. They both knew it too well. Instead, they spoke about what followed. "I keep thinking about that moment," Sandra said thoughtfully, her hands wrapped around a warm mug. "Right before the lights went out, that split second when everyone realized something was wrong, but no one knew how bad it was yet." Keanu nodded, his gaze steady. "That's where everything changes," he replied. "That moment decides whether fear takes control or whether people find each other." Sandra looked at him carefully. "Do you ever wonder why we didn't freeze?" He considered the question before answering. "I think we've both learned in different ways that panic doesn't protect anyone, staying present does." The cafe buzzed quietly around them, unaware that two people were dissecting a moment that had altered their internal compass. What struck Sandra most wasn't the danger they had faced, but the clarity it had brought. The fire had stripped life down to essentials. There had been no image to manage, no expectations to meet, no roles to perform. There had only been people, fear, and choices. In the weeks that followed, that clarity began influencing decisions in small but meaningful ways. Sandra found herself slowing down more often, listening more carefully, choosing presence over distraction. She reached out to people she hadn't spoken to in years, not out of obligation, but out of genuine care. The fire had reminded her that connection was not something to postpone. Keanu, meanwhile, became more intentional about how he showed up in everyday moments. He listened more deeply, spoke less but with greater purpose, and paid attention to the emotional climate of the spaces he entered. He realized that leadership wasn't reserved for crises. It existed in patience, in kindness, in modeling calm when others felt overwhelmed. Neither of them spoke publicly about the incident. There were no dramatic retellings, no attempts to shape the narrative. That night had not been about recognition, and turning it into one would have felt dishonest. What mattered was what they carried forward, not what others saw. Yet the impact of that night continued to ripple outward in ways neither of them fully anticipated. People they had helped on the train reached out occasionally, sharing how the experience had changed them, how it had altered their perspective on fear, on strangers, on their own capacity to act when it mattered. These messages were not heavy. They were grateful, reflective, and quietly powerful. Sandra read one such message late one evening, sitting alone in her living room. The writer described how they had always assumed they would panic in an emergency, how the fire had proven them wrong, and how that realization had carried into other parts of their life. She felt tears well in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the profound understanding that moments of courage rarely stop with the moment itself. She shared the message with Keanu, adding only a simple line, "This is what stayed with me." His reply came not long after, "Me too. This is how change actually happens." The fire had been destructive, but it had also been revealing. It exposed fear, yes, but it also exposed strength, empathy, and the quiet power of collective action. It reminded them both that resilience was not about standing alone, but about standing together, even among strangers. As months passed, the memory softened, no longer sharp with urgency, but steady like a compass pointing toward what truly mattered. Sandra and Keanu did not cling to the experience, nor did they try to forget it. They let it become part of them, woven into how they moved through the world. The train fire had been a single night in their lives, but its echoes continued shaping choices, deepening empathy, and reinforcing a truth neither would ever unlearn. When fear arrives without warning, kindness is not a luxury. It is a necessity, and those who choose it, even quietly, help light the way for others to follow. The weight of what remains, turning survival into purpose. The fire no longer appeared in dreams, nor did it interrupt sleep with sudden jolts of remembered fear, yet its presence remained quietly woven into daily life. It showed up in pauses, in moments of reflection that arrived without warning, and in choices that now carried more intention than before. Survival had passed, but meaning was still unfolding. Sandra Bullock noticed the change most clearly in silence. Moments that once felt empty now felt full, as though they carried an invitation to listen rather than an urge to escape. She spent more time sitting with her thoughts, letting emotions surface without immediately explaining them away. The experience on the train had reminded her that control was often an illusion, and that strength didn't always come from holding everything together, but from allowing oneself to feel without judgment. She began volunteering quietly, without announcement or attention, choosing spaces where people were navigating uncertainty and fear long before it erupted into crisis. She didn't talk about the train unless asked. Instead, she offered patience, empathy, and the kind of calm presence she had learned was more powerful than words. The fire had taught her that showing up mattered far more than being seen. Keanu Reeves, too, carried the experience forward in his own way. He found himself drawn to conversations about resilience, not in formal settings, but in everyday moments that revealed how people coped with pressure, loss, and unexpected change. He listened carefully, recognizing familiar patterns of fear and courage, understanding now more deeply how thin the line between them could be. The train fire had reinforced something he had long believed but now understood viscerally. People don't need saving as much as they need support. They need someone to stand steady when the ground feels unstable, someone who doesn't rush to fix, but stays present long enough for strength to emerge. When Sandra and Keanu met again, it felt less like a continuation of a shared event and more like an evolution of a shared understanding. They walked through a quiet park, leaves crunching underfoot, the world moving around them at an unhurried pace. The conversation flowed naturally, touching on life, work, and the subtle ways the experience had altered their perspective. "I think about that night more than I expected," Sandra admitted, her tone reflective rather than troubled. "Not because of the danger, but because of what it revealed." Keanu nodded. "About people. And about myself," she added. "About what actually matters when everything else falls away." They stopped near a bench, sitting side by side, watching children play in the distance. The scene felt almost symbolic, a reminder of continuity, of life moving forward regardless of what had been endured. For me, Keanu said thoughtfully, it changed how I think about responsibility. Not the kind that comes with titles or expectations, but the kind that comes from simply being capable in a moment when others are. Sandra considered his words. That kind of responsibility doesn't announce itself. No, he agreed, it just asks whether you'll answer. The fire had asked that question of everyone on the train. Some had frozen, some had panicked. Others had stepped forward quietly, guided not by heroism but by instinct and empathy. None of those reactions defined who people were permanently, but they revealed something essential in that moment. As weeks turned into months, the story of the fire faded from public memory, replaced by newer headlines, newer emergencies. But for those who lived it, the experience remained a quiet reference point, a reminder that strength was not abstract. It was practical, human, and often understated. Sandra found herself less tolerant of unnecessary conflict, less patient with noise that distracted from substance. She chose depth over surface, authenticity over performance. The fire had not made her fearless, but it had made her clearer, more aware of how quickly everything could change and how important it was to act with intention while time allowed. Keanu experienced a similar clarity, though it expressed itself differently. He became more deliberate in how he offered support, more conscious of the influence calm could have on others. He understood now that leadership wasn't about stepping into the spotlight, but about reducing fear in the room, about making space for others to find their footing. They never framed these changes as lessons learned from a dramatic event. That would have oversimplified something deeply personal. Instead, they let the experience inform their actions quietly, shaping choices that felt truer, more aligned with who they were beneath expectation. One evening, after a long conversation, Sandra said something that stayed with Keanu long after they parted ways. "I don't think the fire changed us," she said gently. "I think it reminded us of who we already were." He reflected on that often, how crisis doesn't create values but exposes them, how adversity reveals the architecture of character that already exists beneath comfort. The weight of what remained from that night was not heavy in the way trauma often is. It was steady, grounding, like a stone carried in a pocket as a reminder of where one had been and what one had endured. It didn't demand attention, but it was always there when needed. As they continued forward in their lives, separate yet connected by that shared moment of fear and courage, Sandra and Keanu carried with them a deeper trust in human resilience. They had seen it firsthand, not in extraordinary acts, but in ordinary people choosing to help one another when circumstances stripped away all pretense. The fire had been a test, but it had also been a turning point. Not because it forced change, but because it clarified purpose. And that clarity, once found, became something neither of them would ever let go. What endures? When courage becomes a way of living. The passage of time has a way of softening sharp edges without erasing meaning. The fire became a story told less often, then rarely, and finally only when something in the present moment gently pulled it back into awareness. For Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves, the night of the burning train no longer lived as an event to revisit, but as a quiet influence that shaped how they moved through the world. It did not demand attention, it guided it. They had both returned fully to their lives, to responsibilities that filled calendars and demanded energy, yet neither felt the same urgency to rush. There was a steadiness now, a deeper patience that came from understanding how quickly certainty could disappear. When stress arrived, as it always did, it no longer felt all-consuming. Perspective had taken root, reminding them that most crises were not fires, and that even fires could be faced with calm and care. Sandra noticed how often people around her sought reassurance without realizing it. A tense pause in conversation, a restless energy before difficult decisions, a quiet fear of being misunderstood. She responded differently now, choosing presence over persuasion, listening over reacting. The train fire had taught her that people did not need perfect answers. They needed to feel seen, steady, and not alone. That understanding became a quiet strength she carried into every interaction. Keanu experienced something similar, though his awareness expressed itself in subtle leadership. In rooms filled with tension, he slowed the pace. In moments of uncertainty, he asked thoughtful questions instead of offering immediate conclusions. He had learned that calm was contagious, that one steady voice could change the emotional direction of an entire space. The night of the fire had shown him that courage was not about dominating fear, but about refusing to let it dictate behavior. When they spoke again, months later, It was with the ease of people who did not need to fill silence. They met not to revisit the past, but because shared understanding has a gravity of its own. Conversation flowed toward meaning naturally, touching on resilience, responsibility, and the quiet choices that define character far more than dramatic moments ever could. "I think about those people sometimes," Sandra said thoughtfully, referring to the passengers from the train. "I wonder how many of them changed something in their lives afterward." Keanu considered this. "Probably more than we'll ever know," he replied, "not because of the fire itself, but because they saw what they were capable of." Sandra nodded slowly. "That's the part that stays with me, knowing that fear didn't win, that kindness showed up first." They understood then that the true legacy of that night was not survival, but transformation. Not in the grand, cinematic sense, but in the deeply human way that changes habits, priorities, and how one responds when faced with uncertainty again. The fire had passed, but the courage it revealed had remained. As life continued, there were moments when challenges arose that felt overwhelming in their own way. Deadlines, conflicts, unexpected losses. Yet in those moments a memory surfaced quietly, not as fear but as reassurance. If they could stand steady then, they could stand steady now. The circumstances differed, but the internal response remained available. Sandra found comfort in that knowledge, especially during times when the world felt heavy with uncertainty. She reminded herself that resilience was not something to summon under pressure, but something to practice daily through compassion, patience, and integrity. The fire had simply accelerated a lesson she might otherwise have learned slowly. Keanu, too, carried that understanding forward, often without consciously naming it. He trusted the process of staying present, of choosing calm even when tension tempted reaction. He knew now that leadership did not require authority, only responsibility, and that responsibility began with how one showed up for others in moments that mattered. The train fire had not made them heroes, nor had it defined them. What it had done was reveal the quiet truth that courage is not reserved for extraordinary people, but available to anyone willing to act with empathy when fear arrives. That truth became part of their internal compass, guiding choices long after the smoke had cleared. Years from now, the details of that night might blur further, but the essence would remain. The feeling of strangers helping strangers, the power of calm in chaos, the reminder that even in moments of danger, humanity has a way of stepping forward, often through the simplest acts of care. And so the story does not end with fire, nor with escape, but with endurance. With the understanding that resilience is not a single act, but a way of living. That kindness is not a reaction, but a choice. And that when people choose to stand together, even briefly, they leave an imprint that lasts far beyond the moment itself. This is what endured after the flames faded. Not fear, not destruction, but the quiet knowledge that strength lives in connection, and that when tested, the human spirit is capable of rising, again and again, through empathy, perseverance, and the courage to remain present when it matters most.